Welcome back. We've got a great panel for papers, and the first one is going to be by Rachel Stella, who is a writer based in Paris, focuses on 20th century modernism, has written film scripts, including ones on Ellsworth Kelly and Antonio Soro. She's translated Félix Fénéon, and she's currently working on a monograph on Eileen Gray's E1027, which will come out with the University of Texas Austin Press. And she's had an ongoing interest in avant-garde periodicals and done some monographic studies on those, one of which is related to her talk today on transformations, publication from the 1950s, but she's also written about Black Mountain Review, a bilingual English-French magazine called Two Cities, as well as a literary arts magazine of the 50s from that was based around Frank O'Hara called Folder. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Stella. He's organized this wonderful conference. He's the head of Department of American Studies here at the Maria Curie-Sklodowska, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right, University in Lublin. He's written about John Cage and other avant-garde authors listed here in the program. And he's also organized a festival around the American composer John Cage. Today he will talk about Robert Motherwell. And here is Jerzy Kutnik.
Each of the great American abstract expressionists of the New York School was unique, but only a few were noted as intellectuals. Of those, Robert Motherwell was probably the only one who began his career, to use his own words, I quote, supposing that an artist might be something of a scholar and a gentleman. An unusual assumption in those days. It reflected his background as a materially privileged son of a California banker who was educated in the country's top universities, Stanford, Harvard, and Columbia. Encouraged by his teachers to pursue a degree in philosophy, he spent a year in France just before World War II, studying the writings of Delacroix. After returning to America, instead of producing a dissertation about a French artist, he resolved to become a painter himself. His academic training and experiences as a teacher predisposed him towards philosophical ideas and literature as the most important source of such ideas. He admitted, I quote, "In the end, I certainly learned more from Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Joyce than from philosophy." Motherwell's education instilled him with a sense of mission to become the mouthpiece for the artists of his generation. As a painter, he was an autodidact who relied on his painterly instinct. But as a spokesman, he relied on his liberal arts education, whose main advantage, he admitted, was, quote, learning to express oneself readily in language. Thus, for most of his life, he wrote, edited others' writings, taught at educational institutions, and delivered public lectures. He mastered language and rhetorical skills and used them effectively. As one critic observes, quote, his coherent prose style could be understood even if the art it discussed was not. Driven by a didactic impulse, Motherwell wanted to educate the general public about modern aesthetics and help younger artists to avoid the pitfalls he was sure they would encounter. At one point, he even intended to write an instructional book, but never did. We can only speculate why he did not carry out the plan. A possible explanation can be gleaned from his writings, which abound in statements about his understanding of what it means to be a writer as well as a painter in America. They all point to his ambivalence about this duplicity, an ambivalence that was multi-layered and had both personal and societal, cultural sources. While it is probably universally true that a painter's fundamental being, to paraphrase one critic, resides in his pictorial imagination, what made Motherwell unique among his painter colleagues and friends was his translating their pictorial ideas into a cogent theory of painting, a verbal construct with which he tried to bridge what he described as, I quote, an unbridgeable abyss between the painter and the non-painter. He not only was not discouraged by the inherently paradoxical nature of the undertaking, but in fact capitalized on the ambivalences, contradictions, dichotomies, dualisms, and polarities intrinsic to his project. Straddling the abyss, for decades he constructed an image of the contemporary American painter intended to challenge pernicious stereotypical misconceptions. Paradoxically, by combating the worst of those stereotypes, epitomized by a saying the French have, which he liked to quote, bête comme un peintre, dumb as a painter, he sometimes put at risk his reputation among his own kind. As Stephanie Terenzio, the editor of Motherwell's collected writings asserts, quote, his verbal skills at first alienated him from depression-sobered American artists, many of them suspicious of qualities they perceived as extra-artistic. The label of the intellectual that the New York School painters pejoratively applied to him bothered Motherwell, but in describing himself as an actor in this particular drama, he accepted that, quote, the other actors quite naturally resent one actor becoming the author as well. What he resented were, quote, the invidious implications of the word intellectual in American society, the belief that an artist must be a feeling imbecile, or probably is not an artist. Wittingly or not, Motherwell sometimes put himself in a rhetorical quagmire. On the one hand, while vehemently contesting anti-intellectual perceptions about painters, he had to cope with their own anti-intellectual impulses. He openly acknowledged that, quote, the rejection by the School of New York of prevailing ideologies tends to lead to a position of anti-intellectualism, more particularly to a distrust of conscious concept. On the other hand, the key to his own definition of creativity in art and his understanding of the function of art and artists was the concept of feeling. He repeatedly emphasized that, quote, the content of any art is just the world as felt, and that, quote again, the need is for felt experience, intense, immediate, direct, subtle, unified, warm, vivid, rhythmic. He admired painters who, like Mark Rothko, quote, created a language of feeling, and with an implacable commitment strived in his own works, quote, to convert the abyss, the void that the world sometimes presents, with love, with sensuality and passion. In this respect, he identified with his fellow abstract expressionists, defending them from attacks on both flanks. He wrote, quote, the School of New York is not intellectual, but intensely emotional, though its members include the most cultivated among the American artists that I know of. And then he added in the way of clarification, quote, to choose emotion rather than intellection can be an intellectual position. But recognizing it as such is problematic for at least two reasons. First, as Motherwell pointed out, quote, most people ignorantly suppose that artists are the decorators of our human existence, the aesthetes to whom the cultivated may turn when the real business of the day is done. But actually, what an artist is a person skilled in expressing human feeling. At the same time, he felt that, quote, the anti-intellectualism of English and American artists has led them to the error of not perceiving the connection between the feeling of modern forms and modern ideas. His remedy was focusing a corrective lens on the artistic medium, which he believed is, quote, the only thing in human existence that has precisely the same range of sensed feeling as people themselves do. And it is only when you think of the medium as having the same potential as another human being that you begin to see the nature of the artist's involvement as it appears to himself, end of quote. Motherwell's synthesis of emotion and intellect is a noteworthy rhetorical feat. His accomplishments, he accomplishes their conceptual fusion in his writings about modern art, aesthetics, and himself. His statements, although described by him as tentative and speculative, are very well thought out and carefully qualified, even if sometimes deliberately equivocal, declaring that his mind, quote, operates more by intuition than by intellectual analysis, as is true with most painters. He establishes a bridge between innermost painterly feelings and intellection, between abstract painting and abstract thought, staking his ground with words which, though allegedly reluctant, are clear, coherent, and convincing. Motherwell describes himself as a visual person, one who, quote, loves poetry and music, but would rather see. In emphasizing his visual predisposition, he not only makes sure that his art is seen in its totality, that is, as encompassing both the physical act and what he calls thinking in painting, but that his thinking about painting is recognized as constituent of the creative process. Again, he uses a double entendre to make his point. On the one hand, he declares, I quote, I think as a painter in paint, and one can only think in painting while holding a brush before a canvas, while at the same time he asserts that, quote, he has never had a thought about painting while painting, but only afterwards. That, he contends, is nothing unusual, because artists, quote, are largely preoccupied when not making art with thinking about it, thinking about what it is. The crucial difference between thinking in painting and thinking about painting is not so much that of time, but that of the medium and its control. While painting, an artist is driven mostly by unconscious impulses, intuition, instinct, or automatisms, which Motherwell points out are largely inaccessible to the will by definition. The function of intelligence, when it intervenes in the process, is to give the picture structured form. As Motherwell explains, quote, I myself have never encountered a first-class painter who didn't exhibit the highest degree of intelligence in every mark he makes in elaborating his pictorial structure. And if intelligence is not just the grasp of structural relations, I, for one, do not know what intelligence is. But the operation of intelligence in painting is not synonymous with discursive thinking, processing to a conclusion through reason, as it is in verbal communication. One of Motherwell's compulsions was, quote, to leap before reflecting. He explains his method of painting. Quote, I begin a painting with a series of mistakes. The painting comes out of the correction of mistakes by feeling. I begin with shapes and colors, which are not related internally nor to the external world. I work without images. Ultimate unifications come about through modulation of the surface by innumerable trials and errors. End of quote. He justifies the method in this way, quote, probably some of my best painting originates from the painful process of digging myself out of some abyss in the surface of a canvas into which I had jumped without due premeditation. Critically, the pictorial relations grasped by the painter are largely non-verbal, and the painting's given format may be animated by some deep intuition of primal structure. Motherwell's favorite example is that of his friend Jackson Pollock, whose, quote, rhythm came literally out of dancing, or, quote again, bodily movement, probably the earliest form of human expression. Though considered sullen and socially inarticulate, as Motherwell argues, quote, in the studio, Pollock was wholly articulate, with his body, arm, wrist, the eye dancing over the canvas on the floor. Tongue-tied, Pollock is remembered for the one quintessential verbal statement by him ever recorded. Everybody knows that statement. When I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. An instance of thinking in painting. Unfortunately, Motherwell points out, quote, there are so many things that ought to be said about modern painting, about its structure, its relation to the self, its social conditioning, that a single idea is bound to seem fragmentary and misleading. It is for this reason that artists often remain silent, disliking words. But it is false to think that modern artists do not know what they are doing, end of quote. Fortunately, Motherwell himself loved words. Despite disliking their use outside of painting, he did not remain silent, choosing, as Dor Ashton put it, a painter's life of the mind. Although painting was his thought's primary medium, he felt obliged to share his insights, conveying to the alienated public a view of modern art and aesthetics from painting's side of the divide, which he was convinced that, quote, painters sometimes see things that word purveyors do not. Writing, as Terenzio observes, as if with his left hand, he delivered what she describes as some of the best and most persuasive texts we have about art. As a writer, Motherwell drew from two essential sources, having, as Ashton puts it, quote, filled his heart's coffers with the wisdom of poets and the imagery of painters. His painterly visual disposition prompted him to adopt a method of composing text analogous to the way he constructed collages, first making notes for a text on large pieces of stiff handmade drawing paper, then pinning the pages on his studio's walls, as he put it, as though they were a series of drawings, moving them around like a collage. He explains, quote, it was only then that I began to hit it exactly, because although I couldn't read them from a distance, I could remember the particular passages from the way they looked. In this manner, I could keep everything in my mind, what I said, what I hadn't said, and rearrange the sequence and order until it all came to life. While Motherwell admits that the method may seem absurd and expensive, he asks, how could a painter cut off his interest in how lines look on a sensuous sheet of paper? Motherwell's visual approach to language allowed him to tap the most important source of ideas about artistic creativity, poetry. He writes, to wit, my vocabulary works only with poetry, that is to say, with non-narrative writing, to which my visual metaphors can be matched with verbal metaphors. The crucial aspect of the affinity between painters and poets is their shared sensitivity to a medium, about which they know more than anyone. They develop a kind of meta-consciousness, an ability to capture their thoughts about and their feelings towards their medium vividly. In art, Motherwell's favorite example was Miro, whose painting he describes in this way. The whole process is pervaded throughout by an exquisite purity, that is, by a concrete and sensitive love for his medium that never distorts the essential nature of the medium, but respects its every nuance of being, as one respects someone one loves. Regarding poetry, Motherwell's true heroes were the French symbolists. It is from them that he argues, quote, Parisian painters have taken over the word poetry in speaking of what they value in painting. As Motherwell reminds us, it was Baudelaire who called colorists epic poets, and Mallarmé who demonstrated that, quote, each word was a link in the chain that he was forging to bind himself to the universe, and so with other poets, composers, and painters. Like early Parisian modernists, Motherwell eagerly embraced these poets' superb poetic awareness, manifested in their concept of the modern and in their language. He affirmed his allegiance to poets and poetry by deriving titles of his works from poems or alluding to them in his visual imagery. But his highest esteem was reserved for James Joyce, of whom he says, quote, "A writer like Joyce can make me just want to paint. The magic of painting is there. It gives you almost a chill what words can do." But note that Motherwell says, "A writer like Joyce can make me just want to paint, not to write." Similarly, the poetic for Motherwell is primarily a quality he finds in painting. Like most people, he uses the concept without defining it, assuming its meaning is obvious. Commenting on modern artists' fascination with the idea of the window, he states, "For me, the window idea is a poetic metaphor. That I will not try to define." The closest he ever came to doing so was in a letter to William Carlos Williams from 1941, in which he invited the poet to join the editorial board of the Triple V, a magazine initiated by André Breton. In explaining the idea behind the project, Motherwell writes, quote, "The concrete result of the program will be, I think, a magazine with a plastic quality, in both the illustrative material and in the magazine itself being treated as an object of sensuous perception, and with a poetic quality in dynamiting the imagination, unknown in this country." In other words, the painter saw in poetry the potential to explode what he called dogmatic intellectualism, and in this way to free modern thought of unnecessary rhetoric. In a prefatory note to a collection of texts by Max Ernst and artists associated with him, he observed, quote, "His, Ernst's, natural history is an act of revolt projected from the level of poetry against the rational approach to nature as we find it in science books. It is a poetic act." Reviewing a show of Piet Mondrian's works, he noted, quote, "A definite and specific and concrete poetry breaks through his bars, a poetry of constructiveness." The epithet he used the most frequently when referring to Jackson Pollock was lyrical, which word combines the concepts of emotional expression and poetic form. Motherwell described himself in the same vein, declaring, for instance, "I take neither my subjects nor the modes of painting them from the world of intellectuals. I have been mainly a lyrical artist, a poet, if you like, with occasional dramatic or satirical overtones." What drew him, a painter, to poetry was, quote, "the plasticity that we painters so admire, which is no less than the poetry of visual relations." He indeed noted a visual analogy between the act of painting and that of writing. Quote, "A fresh white canvas is a void, as is the poet's sheet of blank white paper." At the same time, he carefully separated poetic content from poetic form, just as he did the lyrical, meaning emotional, from the intellectual. Adding this disclaimer, "From my writing, it would seem that I am more interested in poetry than painting," which of course is not at all true. It is that the poets have speculated much more in words about what the modern is. Among the painters of his generation, certainly none speculated more in words than about the modern than Motherwell himself. Tellingly, however, as a writer, he never attempted any poetry of his own, but confined himself to prose exclusively. Given his literary knowledge and taste, it may seem surprising that his essays do not display the formal inventiveness and boldness that we associate with modern poetry. A closer look, however, reveals that their discursive cohesiveness is achieved by means of collage, which he called, quote, the 20th century's greatest creative innovation. He declared, I quote, part of the quote has been already used, "To wit, my vocabulary works only with poetry, that is to say, with non-narrative writing, to which my visual metaphors can be matched with verbal metaphors, springing from the same kind of source, so to speak, that is, not illustration, but a series of explosions, of fireworks, or oppositely, a kind of restrained silence." Yet, there are neither fireworks nor silence in his texts, just pure prose that is lucid and coherent. Motherwell maintained that he, quote, would much rather paint than write, adding that he was, quote, something of a perfectionist. As a rule, perfectionists are never satisfied. Motherwell was not. He said, quote, "My writing does not compare in depth or originality with my painting. Yet, even if his writings are not of the same caliber as his paintings, they need not be. It is enough that they excel in their own class, as they do. Ultimately, they beautifully accomplish what he wanted his works to do." He described the goal of this in this short statement from 1945, a statement about a collage he made 2 years earlier entitled Personage, Auto Portrait. I quote, "To begin with, this picture is not abstract. But if my picture is not abstract, it's imaginative. Its feeling content happens to be just how I feel to myself, hence its name, Auto Portrait, expressed as directly and cleanly and relevantly as I can communicate the concrete felt pattern of my senses." Thank you.
Our next paper. There we go. Franz Kline and the Artist's Interview, presented by James Finch, who's a second-year PhD student researching the writings of David Sylvester at the University of Kent in partnership with the Tate. And please welcome James Finch.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I'd like to thank the organisers for having me at this great conference. The call for papers for this conference referred to Franz Kline's fondness for quoting Louis Armstrong when asked about his painting. "Brother, if you don't get it, there ain't no way I can explain it to you." This attitude was quite reasonably... Thank you. Sorry, how's this? Okay. This attitude was quite reasonably contrasted with Barnett Newman, whom Kline allegedly described as an intellectual rather than an artist, a painter of ideas rather than a painter. Newman said of the titles given to his works that, quote, "In titles I try to evoke the emotional complex that I was under. For example, with one of the paintings, which I call Vir Heroicus Sublimis, that man can be or is sublime in relation to his sense of being aware," end quote. Kline, on the other hand, implied that many of his works were titled by his gallerist Sidney Yanis. Asked about his titles, he said, "Sidney does have this remarkable way in which he can say bridge or four square or black. I don't think about it that way, and this is four square" by Kline. This is the sort of contrast which would naturally lead us to consider Newman as a far more appropriate subject for this conference than Kline, who is actually a notable absence from the so-called irascibles shown here, who wrote to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1950 protesting against its neglect of abstract art. But at the same time, it is important to remember that Kline was, as one of the foremost New York abstract expressionists, part of a strongly interdisciplinary scene which included a number of poets, writers, and composers. And among his peers, he was greatly admired for his conversation and personality, similar to his near contemporary, born on the other side of the world, Francis Bacon. As Kline's friend Elaine de Kooning wrote, quote, "Some artists hide, others, Michelangelo, Cellini, Delacroix, Van Gogh, Dostoevsky, expose themselves, keep journals, write sonnets, and some, like Franz Kline, talk. For these, nothing they have done or thought or said is irrelevant. Everything helps," end quote. So if, as de Kooning suggests, everything helps, it was perhaps necessary to document this talk, and Kline, like Francis Bacon, wrote almost nothing for public consumption, but became a popular interviewee whose interviews have inevitably made a significant contribution to readings of their art. The artist interview has been around since at least the Renaissance, with critics and historians such as Vasari and Filip making good use of it, but it had never established itself to the degree that it did in the 1950s, when the proliferation of art magazines, radio stations, and television channels all offered platforms for such interviews. Furthermore, the celebrity and controversy of artists such as Kline offered another incentive for interviewers to try and get answers to what they thought were the most important questions about their art. I would speculate that prior to the 20th century, artists' own writings, such as those mentioned before by de Kooning, or the theoretical treatises such as those by Sir Joshua Reynolds or William Hogarth, greatly outnumbered the amount of artist interviews or similar projects, such as the essayist William Hazlitt's Conversations with the painter James Northcote. Today, by contrast, I expect that amongst commercially successful artists at least, the interview is a much more popular form. The now familiar format of the book-length interview series has enabled artists such as Jeff Koons to develop working relationships with favoured interviewers and generate hundreds of pages of his words, while exhibition catalogues and monographs rarely fail to include an interview with the artist, if possible. The promotional and publicity value of such interviews is not to be forgotten either. During Kline's lifetime, the interview had yet to become such a ubiquitous format. Rather, the 1950s marked a point of confluence during which the interview and artist's statement were on parallel tracks. The critic Lawrence Alloway, whose essay Artists as Writers this paper is indebted to, wrote that, quote, "The statement as an exhilarating blend of aphorism and slogan has been used brilliantly by American artists. It was the standard form of the It Is writers," end quote. It Is being a magazine published between 1958 and 1960, consisting mainly of contributions from the abstract expressionists. As Alloway points out later on in the same essay, the pop artists in the early 1960s made their key statements through the form of interviews with Gene Swenson in Art News magazine, while in the later 60s and 70s we find ever more complex uses of the format by minimal and conceptual artists. The 1950s were a crossroads then. The Paris Review started and set a new standard for literary interviews. The Archives of American Art set up its oral history program. And amongst American artists of the time, approaches to the interview as a genre varied widely. Robert Motherwell, who, as we've just heard, was an extremely gifted writer and highly conscious of the relation between his art and writing, he edited his own interviews, adding footnotes and subordinate clauses to his own responses. Ad Reinhardt interviewed himself for Art News, subverting the conventions of its long-running Artist Paints a Picture series and cementing the links between him and the next generation of artists. Mark Rothko, on the other hand, was highly aware of the significance that could be attached to his interviews and avoided them for just this reason. I think that the sensibility of Motherwell, Rothko, and Reinhardt is similar to the approach which is becoming increasingly conventional, which is that even if we still separate interviews from artist writings per se, then we consider the borders between them as somewhat fluid. These are examples of the convention of compiling books of artists' writings and interviews together, and of course, in practical terms, interviews are generally considered no less valid as a source to quote from than written statements themselves. And in the retrospective of Kline's work at Castello di Rivoli in 2004, the substantial catalogue assembled most of Kline's interviews in the absence of writings by him to perform the same task. And it is for this reason that I think it is valid to consider interviews in the context of artists as readers, writers, and literati. But the way in which interviews are often presented poses its own problems. The catch-all term interview covers a large and diverse area which the art historian Christoph Lichtin has discussed in his book Das Künstlerinterview, Analyse eines Kunstprodukts, describing a number of categories which artist interviews may be considered within. The discussion of published interviews in particular raises questions of authorship and agency, and this is another reason to consider the interviews of certain artists as part of a corpus of written work. For amongst artists such as Gerhard Richter, like authors such as Milan Kundera, who have closely supervised the editing of their interviews, there is no doubt about the interviewee's agency. In the case of Kline, however, I have seen no evidence of him taking any role in the editing process or attaching any significance to his interviews as documents or tools for the study of his work. This makes them all the more problematic as they are the primary source of him reflecting upon his work. But on the other hand, his apparent lack of involvement with their final form allows us to see all the more clearly the different ways in which his interlocutors have used the interview form to their own ends. And in the remaining time, I'm going to show how this can be seen in 4 interviews Kline gave between 1956 and his death in 1962. I'll start with Kline's last interview, made with Catherine Q in 1962 and published shortly after his death in Q's book, The Artist's Voice. Q, shown in this newspaper clipping, interviewed 17 artists for her book, from elder statesmen of American art like Stuart Davis and Edward Hopper, to European émigrés, including Joseph Albus and Marcel Duchamp. Q didn't usually record her interviews and said they were transcribed verbatim without what she described as literary editing. I haven't seen transcripts for any of the interviews in the book, although a notebook among Q's papers in the archives of American art does include abortive interviews with Joseph Cornell and Mark Rothko that she hoped to include in the book. From these we can see how Q wrote out her questions in advance and worked through them, leaving ample space to write down the responses and inevitably giving an artificial character to the interviews. The Rothko interview, by the way, does include some wonderful exchanges, particularly when she asks who his influences are, and he responds bluntly, "None of your business. I'm not an art critic." So that gives some indication, perhaps, of why it didn't get published. The Cornell interview also is just full of big blank spaces where he appears not to answer her questions at all. Kline's interview with Q is representative of most interviews in the book, including a similar number of questions about his ideas about his own art, his process, and his background and influences, rather than the more theoretical questions she asked Duchamp and Naum Gabot. Q's declared aim in interviewing these artists was to provide, quote, a composite picture of how dissimilar, how irreconcilable, how parallel, how constant, how valid yet varied are their multiple reactions, end quote. And her introduction makes this clear by highlighting the different intentions and practices that her book draws out. The individual interviews are sometimes of little interest, but reading them together, one appreciates how she looked to assemble a network which grounded discussion amongst varied painters and sculptors in a common vocabulary. But the pathos of the book lies in the fact that different artists interpret her favoured terms, such as realism, so differently as to make any such conclusions of questionable value. In 1960, Kline had been interviewed by the British critic David Sylvester. This is the opening of Kline's 1960 Sydney Yanis exhibition, with Sylvester at the back and Kline on the left, amongst a number of other artists, some of whom you might recognise. This interview was one of a series Sylvester recorded in the BBC's New York studios in 1960, which was broadcast on the BBC, then published in the short-lived magazine Living Arts, ran by London's Institute of Contemporary Arts. The transcript for this interview shows that a considerable amount of editing went into preparing the interview, firstly for broadcasting and then again for eventual publication. Any informality was eliminated in keeping with Sylvester's feelings that in interviews, clarity and precision was much more important than fidelity to the words as originally spoken. In the published version, the laughter which punctuates Kline's conversation is not acknowledged, making his responses seem deadpan. The formal presentation of Sylvester and Q's interviews went against a developing trend towards publishing seemingly unedited transcripts, and this was made possible by the increasing availability of portable tape recorders. But Sylvester did take advantage of the studio recording facilities by improvising his questions, eliminating unsuccessful material, and revising the structure in the editing process. Comparison with Sylvester's other interviews with artists such as Barnett Newman, Robert Motherwell, and Ad Reinhardt shows that the interview with Kline required far more editing to impose a satisfactory structure on the discussion. Where Q's pre-written questions were designed to be autonomous, so that she could ask them one after the other without worrying about the previous response from the artist, Sylvester's interview is much more conversational and more cohesive in the linguistic sense that the questions refer and respond to earlier points in the conversation. I've brought up a series of questions from the interview which you don't need to read in full, but they demonstrate the tenacity and persistence of Sylvester's interviewing process. After Kline answers the first question affirmatively, Sylvester subtly probes the area that it opens up. He addresses Kline's intentions in making his paintings, his awareness at different points when making them, and what the completed painting conveys. And you could see this as something like an attempt to elicit what thinking in painting means, if it's possible to do so. Like Q, Sylvester had favoured questions, but the important thing about his interviews is not the individual questions, but the connections between them and the sense of a conversation leading each interview in its own direction. Sylvester and Q's interviews are ostensibly impartial, you might think, although the transcript does show that some interesting material was cut out of the Sylvester interview, notably an anecdote about Kline repainting a motif that looked too much like a boot in one of his paintings to try and avoid people looking at it and just thinking it's a picture of a boot. Okay. Selden Rodman's 1957 Conversations with Artists, on the other hand, is openly polemical, and like his earlier book, The Eye of Man, Form and Content in Western Painting, it seeks to affirm the superiority of figurative painting. Rodman himself makes clear in the introduction his greater sympathy for Ben Shahn over Willem de Kooning. And Rodman's journalistic profiles are often tinged with antagonism, particularly with an encounter with an angry Mark Rothko at an exhibition opening. Rothko comes up to Rodman and he's angry about something Rodman had written before, so Rodman scribbles down everything Rothko writes and kind of puts that in the next book. So it's kind of an interesting development of this thing. Here it seems that Rodman is eager to portray Kline as unlearned or lacking in intellectual curiosity, and this is something of the reputation that Kline has since acquired. And he quotes Kline to little purpose as saying, quote, "Salvador Dali once told me my work was related to John of the Cross, who he called the painter, the poet of the night. Not having read him, I wouldn't know," end quote. Our understanding of statements made in interviews depends partly upon knowledge of the questions which elicited those statements in the first place, and Rodman rarely provides this. For instance, he doesn't tell us why Kline made that comment about John of the Cross. This omission is taken to the extreme in my final example, the monologue Franz Kline Talking, published in avant-garde San Francisco magazine Evergreen Review in 1959. O'Hara himself seems to have realized that the interview was as much his as the artist's, writing to Art News editor Tom Hess about the article, quote, he has it coming out, end quote. The context as well as the method is different here. The other interviews with Kline were all made as part of a series by that one interviewer, but O'Hara's was a one-off which appeared in the Evergreen Review, as you can see here, not alongside other artist interviews, but poetry such as O'Hara's own In Memory of My Feelings, dedicated to the painter Grace Hartigan, and An Ode to Jackson Pollock by Michael McClure. O'Hara himself was known for incorporating artists' talk into his own poems, such as Why I Am Not a Painter, while the year after this interview, O'Hara and Kline collaborated on a series of 21 etchings and poems, of which this is one. Following a short introduction from O'Hara, the text consists of a series of anecdotes and meditations from the artist, which remind us of Elaine de Kooning's observation that, quote, anecdotes were Franz Kline's shop talk. Literature, religion, philosophy, art theory were subjects to be avoided, too vague, too ponderous. He was in love with the actual and the specific, end quote. The resulting monologue is rambling and improvisatory, and unlike either interviews or artist statements. To give you an idea of the idiosyncratic style, it ends like this, quote, some painters talking about painting are like a lot of kids dancing at a prom. An hour later, you're too shy to get out on the floor. Hell, half the world wants to be like Thoreau at Walden, worrying about the noise of traffic on the way to Boston. The other half use up their lives being part of that noise. I like the second half, right? To be right is the most terrific personal state that nobody is interested in. And that's how it ends, end quote. The critic Irving Sandler, who knew both men, O'Hara and Kline, wrote of Kline that, quote, Frank O'Hara did manage to pin him down in his interview titled Franz Kline Talking, but only by later reimagining his responses and manner of speaking. Indeed, only a poet with O'Hara's fit for language could have invented Franz's monologues so accurately, end quote. Sandler recently told me that he found Sylvester's interview very useful for the information it provided on Kline's practice, but that O'Hara's was the most faithful to the artist's voice. O'Hara's interview, presented as a monologue, appears closest to an artist's statement, and the high regard in which it is held by Sandler, Elaine de Kooning, and others is another reason to see this interview as our best evidence of Kline as a writer. But Sandler, in talking of O'Hara's invention and reimagining, highlights O'Hara's active role in producing this text. And the Kline who emerges from this unpredictable, improvisatory text embodies O'Hara's description of him as the action painter par excellence, just as much as the other interviews create their distinct versions of the artist in correspondence with the interviewer's ideas of him. Louis Morin wrote that all written interviews are the fiction of the oral interview from which they derive, and in Kline's case, I agree. They are writings, but we must remember they're always writings with more than one author. Thank you.
The next talk, Dr. Filip Lipiński, Inscribed Canvases, Writing and Painting in American Art. He is an art historian and Americanist, assistant professor in the Department of Art History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. He was a Fulbright in New York at the City University of New York and recipient of a Terra Foundation for the American Summer Residency in France. He had a Terra Travel Grant in the US in 2013, and he has published Virtual Hopper Images in a Remembering Look by the, I'm not going to say this, as well as many academic articles and contemporary art and art theory. Please welcome Filip Lipiński.
First of all, thank you for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be here because 3 weeks ago, Professor Kutnik and Edyta Frelik were at our smaller conference in Poznan, so I think it's a nice beginning of a fruitful exchange. And my paper won't be that historical, it'll be rather theoretical, so I may come across a little bit of a little bit of an oddball here. And I will be referring to somewhat dated, as Verle noted yesterday morning, theory of textuality. But I think in this context, in the context of this conference, it's quite fruitful as long as we remember as we complement it with due attention to the matter of the of the paintings. Okay, here we go. And I'll start with two quotes with which sort of set the tone from well-known works. The first one is from Jacques Derrida, Writing Indifference. Play includes the work of meaning, or the meaning of work, and includes them not in terms of knowledge, but in terms of inscription. And the other one is from well-known essay by Roland Barthes, The hand cut off from any voice, born by a pure gesture of inscription, and not of expression, traces a field without origin, or which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. The idea in practice of including text on and in pictures is neither a new phenomenon nor restricted to American painting. The issue of pictorial inscription implicates a series of questions related to the old Lessinghian binary of space and time, or the relationship between the activity of looking and reading, the visual and the verbal. Furthermore, such basic textual elements as an author's signature and the title have always been parallelinally orbiting on both sides of the frame of the work, interfering with its visuality, putting its often desired visual purity and unity in danger. In this paper, however, I will look at the selected cases in American painting of the second half of the 20th century in which text or the activity of writing became a constitutive element of the picture, where a canvas became a space of inscription. Inscription and writing here will have a double meaning. Firstly, they will refer to painted or drawn words on a pictorial surface, and secondly, to a more general deconstructive condition of generating and proliferating meaning, to writing defined by Jonathan Culler as, I quote, a series of physical marks that operate in the absence of the speaker, which subverts the idea of immediate expression, the voice of the artist, and accessible origin. Jacques Derrida, in an interview concerning visual arts, wrote that, or said that, while the spatial works of art present themselves as silent and their mutism produces an effect of full presence, they, and I quote here, are in fact already talkative, full of virtual discourses, and from that point of view, the silent work, the silent work becomes an even more authoritarian discourse. It becomes the very place of a word that is all the more powerful because it is silent, end of quote. The forward gesture of combining the pictorial with the textual deconstructs the reductive modernist ideas of purity of medium and metaphysics of silent presence of an artwork. That does not mean textual reduction of the visual, but rather testifies to its always complex and differential structure, because even, and I quote Derrida again, the most overwhelmingly silent works cannot help but be caught within a network of differences and references that give them a textual structure, end of quote. In such a case, especially when dealing with writing in painting, a category of image text written together or with a slash introduced by W.J.T. Mitchell comes in handy as one marking the above-mentioned complexity and impurity, which here relates both to ontological and epistemological dimension of a work of art. Importantly, the medium of writing itself, in Mitchell's view, and I quote him, in its physical, graphic form, is an inseparable suturing of the visual and the verbal, the image text incarnate. Perhaps surprisingly, a discussion about writing in painting, but also as painting, can begin despite Greenbergian fetishization of medium specificity with abstract expression, which is nicely sort of refers to our previous talk, with abstract expressionism and the artistic practice of some of the most painterly of painters. Franz Kline's black and white paintings have been discussed in terms of Asian calligraphy, and Jackson Pollock's dripping technique was compared to surrealist automatic writing, and very often it referred to writing in general. Pollock's action painting resembled writing in many respects. For instance, it can be thought of in these terms due to its horizontal orientation of the canvas when being painted, but also to a network of the lines drawn with a stick, dried brush, or poured directly from a can, which, as Michael Fried argued, did not circumscribe any form or shape, but were self-sufficient lines to be received optically. The myth of abstract expressionism has it that the mark of paint was the most direct transposition of the self, the unconscious, in the body of the artist, an indexical sign of presence and action. One could say that the canvas was the site of literal inscription of the artist who was writing himself into the canvas. This could imply control and successful communication desired by Pollock, but as we know he was ambiguous about it, when he hand-wrote the following words, and I quote Pollock, "Technique is the result of a need. New needs demand new techniques. Total control, denier of the accident," end of quote. Critics have always been divided as to Pollock's mastery of his painterly script. I am partial to a deconstructive interpretation of his work by Anasi Shave, who claims that despite his pronouncements, his art is, and I quote here, an ingenious way of testifying to the failure of writing or painting or drawing to represent experience. And, she adds, the significance of Pollock's tangled script lay elsewhere in the act of writing itself, end of quote. Writing here would not be one of the logocentric order, control, presence, or successful representation and fixation of meaning, but of the constructive writing understood as an acknowledgement of loss of control and direct referentiality. In fact, Pollock's dripping technique involves loss of touch, the space between the brush and the surface of the canvas, and this spacing or abyss becomes a performative figure of both deconstruction and regeneration of painting. Pollock's drip paintings both induce desire for reference and defer it. They become sites of numerous virtual inscriptions performed by the viewers and writers on his work. The never-ending search for figures or actual words in the classic all-over canvases by Pollock, present in literature on his work, only testifies to this desire. From the 1950s, not only distinctive figures or even three-dimensional objects began to emerge in American painting, but also writing gained more concrete manifestation in paintings, in the form of actual textual signs. If, to paraphrase Harold Rosenberg's famous dictum, a canvas used to be an arena in which to act, now it was more and more often an arena in which both to write and read, in an iconically differential embrace of seemingly disparate sign system. A perfect example of this situation is Cy Twombly, whose work has been quite rightly discussed many times in terms of writing, which, perceived in the context of action painting, emerged from the formlessness of Pollock's canvases as both the denial and dialogical continuation. Jeffrey Weiss wrote that, I quote here, "We can even say that Twombly's significance partly reflects the nature of his work as an interpretative project, with Pollock as his primary referent," end of quote. Twombly drawing, and I have some more, drawing and overdrawing, smearing, erasing, overtly renounces Pollock, pretends to mastery, makes this clumsiness of figure and text its subject. Twombly's painting is consciously about the renouncement of mastery, an attempt at finding a script or code which would convey the idea of writing in painting as writing. His work looks as if, after Pollock's deconstruction of representation, he was literally starting from scratch, a scratch on the surface of a canvas or a sheet of paper, always already a sensitive membrane or an interface for the interlacing of drawing, writing, and painting. The traces of pencil or crayon on canvas sometimes imply writing as activity or concept. The other time they are actual words, like a scribble, which can both consist of legible and illegible signs. Twomley's interest in the so-called high European culture signaled in the titles of his works such as Arcadia, The Italians, or Leda and the Swan, offers possible intertext to be read into his works, but any attempt of iconographic or symbolic readings is thwarted by the complexity and impurity of the medium. Moreover, as Anna Lovett wrote, and I quote her here, "The subject of writing is not an isolated author, but a layered system of differential relations in which the writer, the instrument of inscription, the reader, and society all play a part." Instead of presenting us with a narrative that is fully present and intact, Twomley offers an incomplete archive of impressions on which our own experience must be brought to bear, end of quote. This is even more acutely felt through the dialectics of looking and reading, uncomfortably displacing each other, loosening up meaning of these writerly canvases. While Twomley's writing and painting always generates a connotation of handwriting, the status of text in Jasper Jones's works is quite different. The text no longer bears the idiomatic character of one's hand, but is ready-made. In his early and famous flag series, Jones appropriated barely legible, but as a whole easily recognizable fragments of newspapers. We can see the printed layer of paper together under the semi-transparent layer of wax and paint, forming the familiar pattern of stars and stripes. Discourse, in the form of printed pages, serves literally and figuratively as an infrastructure of the painting. In other works, Jones used a stencil, and here is a close-up of what I was talking about. In other works, Jones used a stencil. Again, in a way, an external element which enables reproduction, reduces the illusion of directness of handwritten script or handwritten or hand-painted script. In his renditions of the US maps, Jones combines an already given structure of the map, which is dissolved by pentally brushstrokes, unavoidably indicating still active legacy of gestural painting. The textual elements which help to pin down the loosened by the brushwork stayed borders are often barely visible, partially overpainted. In contrast to a more demonstrative alphabet series of works by Jones, referring to language as a system, some of his other paintings incorporate visual textuality in a more subtle way. A good example of which is, again mentioned before, is Jones's personalized flag painting in memory of my feelings, Frank O'Hara, referencing a beautiful poem by the New York writer mentioned in the title. The title of the painting lurks from the gray smudges of paint at the left bottom edge of the canvas, which we see here in the fragment, virtually injecting the painting with the text of the poem, appropriating it for its own purpose in an irresolvable differential play between the literary text, the painting, and possibly, if we, for instance, follow Jonathan Katz's interpretation, the biographical text of the artist signaling the personal split between Jones and his partner, Robert Rauschenberg. Therefore, we can say that in his diversely inscribed works, Jones seems to visualize or even materialize the basic structure of language, which literally underwrites the meaning of the painting and is offered as a ready-made system to be put into action through painting. Jones seems to employ what Rauschenberg, whose work for the sake of brevity I chose not to discuss here, said about the use of newspaper in his work. He used them as a ground for his works, and I quote Rauschenberg here, so that even the first stroke in the painting had its own unique position in a gray map of words. End of quote. The process of traditionally understood inscription is thus reversed. Textuality is not introduced through inscribed words or superimposed on a canvas, or inscribed or superimposed on a canvas words, but it is activated by paint and visible brush strokes as something which has always inhabited the blank canvas but waited for the right impulse to become visible, given to be read and seen at the same time. Among pop art painters who emerged in the 1960s, Ed Ruscha is one who gave words in his painting the most prominent place and often commented on the status of words and images. In one of the interviews, he said that these are words and images, quote, two things that don't even ask to understand each other, end of quote. Indeed, in his paintings, words are located in visual space against an abstract background, depending on a quasi-photographic imagery, which become, as one critic put it, anonymous sets for the theater of words. More often than not, the relationship to the image seems arbitrary or at least ambivalent. The slick and unemotional handling of paint by Ruscha displaces words and images and disconnects them from their alleged expressive function. Onomatopoeias or short phrases seem to come from the outside of the picture as if only heard, overlapping with the image. They are no longer related to any specific event, but function as transferable logos. This lack of or questionable connection to the visual referent sometimes turns them into visual objects, something more to be looked at than read. They also become obstacles to see the main motive fully. And I quote Ruscha again, words are pattern-like, and in their horizontality then answer my investigations into landscape. They are almost not words, they are objects that become words, end of quote. In fact, Ruscha can be said to be a landscape painter. Landscape in its horizontal development and as space to be traversed spatially and temporally is also a narrative to be viewed and read, especially in the American context where landscape plays an important role as a carrier of American mythology. Letters here are emblems and elements of complex visual discourse. Next, I wish to briefly discuss a work by Glenn Ligon, an artist who started his career in the 1980s when postmodern aesthetics dominated American art scene along with the new impulse to paint. He covered his canvases with stenciled appropriated text and against a monochromatic background, sometimes in such a way that letters constitute a physical texture of the canvas. Paint becomes the substance of letters. Darby English noted, and I quote, Ligon's practice amounts to a postmodernism that engages modernism deconstructively rather than dismissing it, end of quote. The postmodern relates to quotation and appropriation as much as intense verbalization of the canvases. It reveals the conditions of meaning-making and interpretation. Modernism is located in emphasizing conditions of the medium and abstract visual quality of these works. Thus, even though Ligon's canvases become scenes of writing which repeat and displace the original text by different authors, often pointing to their political potential, most of them, due to their pictorial aspects, cannot be just consumed in the activity of reading. In a vertically oriented untitled series of works, which we see here, Ligon repeats the title phrase throughout the door size surface in lines, weaving a kind of a textual figure from top to bottom. The painting and the reading starts with a quotation, followed by its repetitions, which make the always already quoted original text less and less legible. The visual discursive situation can be interpreted in a variety of ways. First, the gradual loss of legibility reveals, which is even more visible here. That's an explicit quote from Ice Cube, the title here. This visual discursive situation can be interpreted in a variety of ways. First, the gradual loss of legibility reveals the difference between seemingly the same, but unavoidably transformed in the process of repeated inscription as a general rule of writing. Second, in more phenomenological terms, repetition of the same but differently looking phrase infused with materiality of the visual, which obfuscates the alleged transparency of the words onto the reference, generates loss of interest in looking as reading in favor of looking as observing, and the gradual transition from one mode to another. But our usual habit of reading from top down can be reversed due to the observer's bodily identification with the work as something to be confronted, seen, and experienced physically in the first place. Hence, the text becomes a figure, seen as emerging from the dominating the lower part darkness and physical painterly texture, to take the form of a more and more legible and immaterial text at the top. Ligon subverts the idea of firstness or origin dialectically in the process of inscribing. As a result, the paintings do not pose obvious binary oppositions but constitute perfect examples of Mitchell's image texts, revealing simultaneously the materiality and visuality of text and textuality of the image. In other works, such as White series, ironically White, White series, Ligon goes even further. Writing is rendered as texture without clearly distinguishable difference in figure background, discouraging reading altogether. In Speech series, the silk-screened photograph is dominated by written text in the following version and in the following versions of the cycle. First we have a photograph. This is the second and third version, and it's the photograph. The silk-screen photograph is taken over by the lettering, which is illegible anyways. In these last works, Ligon introduces another visual layer of the photographic into play and makes the medial status of writing and painting even more complex issue, which I do not have time to discuss here in further detail. And finally, Ligon's work reminded me of another American painter, Mark Tansey, whose monochromatic photorealistic pictures function as painterly visualization of post-structuralist theory. In his Reader, we see a man running into a page of printed text. The canvas is a written and painted at the same time book page. The painted page comes from Paul de Man's Blindness and Insight, an important 1971 post-structuralist collection of essays in which blindness is potentially a moment of the utmost insight. And as the man wrote, I quote, reading is an endless process in which truth and falsehood are inextricably intertwined, end of quote. The painted page is one from an essay on modernity, in which, on this specific page number 146, the man analyzes Nietzsche's thoughts on modernity, a condition of which seems to be, I quote, ruthless forgetting the blindness with which he throws himself into an action lightened of all previous experience, end of quote. The reader represented here seems to be one who does so. He is not someone who rationally distances himself from the text, but physically runs into it and disappears in a textual abyss, loses or forgets himself in action. The text, coming back to my initial remarks, can be seen as akin to Pollock's arena in which to act and to forget oneself in a direct contact with the canvas through entering it. However, as the man demonstrates a few pages further, Nietzsche realizes that such forgetfulness and disconnection from the past and history is impossible, leads to an aporia, and the desire of clean start becomes another modernist utopia. Thus, the represented in the painting runner as reader can also be interpreted as a figure of an artist, as well as a viewer, in front of a picture who, instead of coming up against a silent, erratic, distancing presence of the canvas, encounters a densely inscribed surface of a painting where writing in painting becomes writing with painting, with each trace of paint as potentially meaningful and talkative sign. Consequently, postmodern painting from pop art to late 20th century made visible and incorporated into the canvas what has been dormant under the abstract and dense layer of seemingly silent grand narratives of modernity. Thank you.
Thank you. And we can open up for a few minutes of questions. Do you have any questions in the audience?
I was impressed by the way you sort of relate post-structuralist theory, and eventually from your hints, the reflections on art, and the sort of politicized, political kind of implications of that. Are there any other artists? Because you've traced beautifully the sort of trajectory from, say, the more sort of formal play, or the playful sort of thing with O'Hara, to your final artists. Are there any other artists that you sort of relate to the connections that you're making between that type of work with text, in the visual field? And
there's plenty. Of course, I was being very selective, so you could create a huge list of such artists who sort of deal with text. I focused here on painting mainly, but if we even with painting, I mentioned we could talk about Rauschenberg, but we could talk about I don't know, Lynn Folks. We could talk about more contemporary artists as well, painters. And of course that would also then we could include a variety of artists who sort of like from the 70s who dealt with text, and but that's a different story, of course. So yeah, I mean that my selection was just a sort of a cut for 20 minutes presentation, maybe 25 actually it was, but sorry for that. So
another question there.
Jurek, your presentation was so complete in itself, it is difficult to raise questions about it. That is, I think, one of the main problems of a very well-formed paper. But maybe you could clarify a little bit on this very intriguing relation between prose, poetry, and painting. If I understood you correctly, you said when he was thinking about painting, he wrote prose. And when he thought in painting, he was close to poetry. So in a sense, his painting is a form of poetry. Is that correct?
Yes. This paper actually grew out of a paper that I wrote last year and gave at a different conference, which was on Barbara Novak's book about American painting in the 19th century. And what fascinated me in that book, that one of the most important categories that she uses to talk about certain types of American painting in the 19th century is poetic or lyrical. And so since then I've been reading all kinds of materials, texts by artists and texts by art historians about art, and I always look for poetry, poetic, lyricism. And I try to see how people use these categories and what they mean when they use them. And like Novak, Motherwell is I think it's a typical example of that. We assume that when we say that a certain type of work of art is poetic, we know what we mean. Like if you think about 19th century American painting, and if I asked you, like, which those who perhaps haven't read the book, probably very few of you, what type of American painting in the 19th century she finds the most poetic? She talks about luminism, but she never defines what she means by poetry. Neither does Motherwell. And what is interesting for me is that my interest in American art started with something very recent and very avant-garde. I wrote my PhD dissertation on the experimental novel of the 60s, 70s. Then I did John Cage, and only then I began to read about art and artists. And what I know from postmodern literature, that when you use the term poetry, read Marjorie Perlow, for example, what poetry means today. So for me, it can no longer be taken for granted that when somebody describes something as poetic, that we all know what he means or she means. And I only wanted to just indicate that with Motherwell, it's just that when, just as you summed up beautifully, when he writes in prose, but he says that he's inspired by poets. When he paints, he calls himself a poet painting. He doesn't call himself a poet when he writes. but only when he paints. So it's an interesting question, and I want to pursue this project, actually. I don't know where it's going to lead me, but I am fascinated by how we use certain categories, and sometimes we take it for granted that we know what they mean, or sometimes we don't know what they mean and don't even want to define them, like Motherwell didn't.
If I can quickly follow up on that, it seems that Motherwell did, I mean, since he was interested in Delacroix, read the text that Delacroix did on painting and literature. I forget the title now. But for Delacroix and Baudelaire and that whole circle, synesthesia would be the way to bring those together. And that seems to be the term which none of you, in a way, have evoked. So if there is a slide away from that 19th century conception of the way the arts relate, which is correspondence and synesthesia, and here they seem to be, I don't know, there is something about the each one being in their own corner while being confronted with each other, but they seem to, something about the medium specificity that seems to offer possibilities, kind of placing them, juxtaposing them, kind of, I don't think that kind of notion of fusion and how it all kind of melts into one synesthetic sensation is a possibility, and Filip's paper definitely points to that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But for me, what is interesting is that with a term like poetry, all of us, especially people who started as students of literature and then literary scholars, we kind of assumed from the beginning where poetry came from and what it meant for hundreds of years or thousands of years. And more today, the word poetry is becoming a metaphor of something. And it's very often hard to say of what. It's a metaphor that different people use for many different things, assuming that others know what the metaphor refers to, and very, very often it does not. Quite simply, different people today will have a different understanding of poetry or lyricist as a metaphor. That's my sense. I don't know what it does to art history or to writings about art and writings about literature, but I think it's a fact.
I just have a quick question for James. I got interested in this O'Hara moment in your talk because some 10 years ago or a little more, I wrote in May on O'Hara and with Professor Lipiński on O'Hara and visual arts, and I looked at that collaborations from O'Hara's point of view a little bit more, but I don't remember if I came across then any mention from Kline concerning, did he mention, did he talk about this collaboration, did he comment on that in one of those interviews? Because it must have been quite a different experience for him. I mean, that was the totally different format, size of work. Definitely much more, something much more, well, intimate collaboration rather than just, approaching a canvas, large format canvas. So I don't remember if there were any sort of like, he commented on it extensively.
Thanks, Filip. No, I've not actually seen any mention of him being asked about that collaboration either. I mean, I think the interesting thing with the Kline interviews is the sorts of things people ask him about, and that's not the aspect of his work that they're interested in. They're kind of, why do you paint? Yeah, exactly. So there's this very certain idea of the kind of information that people want to get from him, and those sorts of things don't come into it. But I would like to say that the Sylvester interview, for example, it's all about what's the relation between the preparatory drawings and the final outcome, and trying to get a sense of the chronology and, what happens when you combine two drawings, what are you thinking about? And so that's how you get the Kline, who emerges as someone who's got this very methodical approach, whereas in the O'Hara text, it's, there's nothing much about his particular works at all. So no, you can't get much on specific paintings or particular collaborations. It's always Kline's work as if it's a whole that people are referring to, when actually, it does break down in more interesting ways than that.
I have a question for James as well. I liked your paper, and it seemed to me you could use the words careerism and also agency to talk about the shift in the interview. Obviously Jeff Koons is controlling everything in Jeff Koons' world, whereas it seems that previous artists were certainly aware of how they were being branded, but they didn't take as much interest in it. I'm wondering if you might reflect on that.
Yeah, that's why I picked Kline, because it seems to be at this moment when the boundaries haven't really solidified. Because I think that nowadays there's a very certain sense of how interviews work, and particularly if it's done for a catalogue or an exhibition, the rule is an artist will say something, but they have their right to change it later if they change their mind, and that's how it works. But at that time, these things hadn't been established yet, and Sandler says that the abstract expressionists as a whole didn't pay any mind to interviews, and it was just people came up to them and asked them if they would talk about their work, and Sandler's sense was that the artists didn't see it in that way as a real promotional tool, which may be simplifying it a bit too much.
Yeah, except that Pollock went out and bought 400 copies of Life magazine, so I think they were very into what their image was. Yeah,
so maybe it's disingenuous, and they want to be seen as not paying too much attention to it, but yeah, it's all performance, and it's all kind of the shaping of their identities, but they do that in different ways, as I said, by talking about Reinhardt, Motherwell, Rothko, all having, even at that stage, very distinct approaches. And I'm very interested in Rothko in this sense of anything you say being enshrined in text, and you have to be very careful about even going there.
And does Sylvester make any comments about the tricks of the trade of interviewing artists? What I mean is, Paul Cummings, in an introduction to artists in their own words, says, well, put them best in the studio, interview them for as long as possible to get the most out of them. You have Rodman saying, pay attention to how they formulate their thoughts, because this can be as much saying as what they say. You have, can't remember, Tuchman, I think, writing that interviewing Delacroix and Rubens wouldn't be that much different from interviewing Warhol or Karl Andrejs. So, there are those tricks, and the interviewer is supposed to act as a kind of a psychoanalyst, interpreter.
Yeah, Sylvester does have a couple of maxims. One of them is never be afraid to hold a pause, and the point when the artist says what they want to say, you kind of let the tumbleweed blow across, and then that's when they'll actually say what they're thinking. Okay, when they've got to the end of the prepared statement, and you have to be prepared to let it be a bit awkward. And another thing is that he said he was always friends with the artists that he interviewed. So whereas I think Rodman, for example, you get the sense of him approaching artists out of the blue, but there's always this kind of camaraderie with Sylvester, which probably has something to do with it. So yeah. There is that. I was going to say something.
And then,
else.
of course, you have Reinhardt being asked, "What does this painting represent?" and answering, "What do you represent?" Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sometimes you get more of a challenge to the interviewer himself, which I think does come up in some of the interviews with Sylvester. People like Newman tend to be a bit more abrasive and turn things back on the interviewer.
Thank you. I think we probably need to break, and there's a lot more conversation, obviously, to be had, so we can continue those more informally.